Clara Whitmore didn't knock on Ethan Caldwell's door. She collapsed against it. Her fist hit the wood twice, and then her legs gave out entirely, and she went down on one knee in the mud, her daughter's small hand still locked inside hers, the little girl too exhausted and too frightened to cry anymore. When the door swung open and a man's voice said, "What in God's name?" Clara looked up from the ground and said the only words she had left. "Please. She hasn't eaten since yesterday." If this story moves you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Every comment means the world to me, and I read every single one. Now, let's begin. The man who opened the door was not what Clara expected. She had imagined, in the desperate and scattered way a person imagines things when they are running out of road, that the owner of Silver Creek Ranch would be older, heavier. The kind of man who took one look at a woman on her knees in the mud and called for someone else to deal with it. Ethan Caldwell was none of those things. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had spent too many years in the Montana sun and didn't apologize for it. His jaw was set hard. His eyes, dark gray, the color of storm clouds that hadn't decided yet whether to break, moved from Clara's face down to the little girl beside her, and something shifted in them, just slightly, just enough. He said nothing for a long moment. Clara pushed herself back to her feet. Her knee was wet from the mud. Her dress was torn at the hem from 3 weeks of traveling. She had 14 cents in her coat pocket, a suitcase with a broken clasp held shut with a strip of leather, and a daughter named May, who was 7 years old, and currently pressing herself so tightly against Clara's side that Clara could feel every small, shallow breath the child was drawing. She was not going to beg. She had promised herself that much. She had walked into every town between St. Louis and Silver Creek, Montana, had stood in front of every church and general store and sheriff's office, had explained her situation with as much dignity as a woman with blistered feet and hollow cheeks could manage. She had watched men look past her. She had watched women pull their children closer. She had heard the word no in so many different voices that she had started to lose the shape of any other word. She was not going to beg. But her daughter hadn't eaten since the morning before, and Clara had already done the math on 14 cents, and the math did not come out to anything a child could live on. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. Her voice was steadier than she deserved. "I am a widow. I have a daughter. I am not asking for charity." She paused. "I am asking for work." Ethan Caldwell looked at her. He had the stillness of a man who had learned that most things people said weren't worth responding to quickly. His right hand rested on the doorframe. His left was hanging loose at his side. He was wearing work clothes, a collarless shirt, worn suspenders, boots that had seen every kind of weather, and he looked at Clara the way a man looks at something that has arrived unexpected and is trying to decide whether it's a problem or not. "Work," he repeated. "Yes, sir. What kind of work do you know how to do?" "Cooking, managing a household, bookkeeping if you've got accounts that need organizing. I can ride, though not well. I learn fast." She kept her chin level. "I won't cause trouble, and I won't ask for more than I earn." He looked at May. May looked back at him. She was small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and a mouth set in a line that was trying very hard to look like it wasn't trembling. She had one hand wound into the fabric of Clara's coat, and the other pressed flat against her own stomach, the way children press against hunger when they've been doing it long enough that it becomes habit. Something moved across Ethan Caldwell's face. It was brief, and he closed it off quickly, but Clara saw it. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "Both of you." Clara didn't let herself exhale until she was through the threshold. The ranch house was large, larger than she'd expected from the outside, a main room with a long plank table, a stone fireplace that was going low, a kitchen visible through an open doorway, and a staircase leading up into shadow. It smelled like wood smoke and leather and faintly like coffee that had been sitting on a stove too long. It was clean in the way that places are clean when someone maintains them out of discipline rather than care. There were no flowers, no curtains on the windows, Nothing on the walls except a map of the territory and a rifle hook with 2 rifles hanging from it. It was a house that had forgotten what it felt like to have people in it. Ethan crossed to the kitchen without looking back at them, and Clara heard the sound of a fire being stoked, a pot being moved, a cupboard being opened. May pressed closer to Clara's side. Clara put her hand on the back of the little girl's head. "It's all right," she said quietly. "We're all right." She didn't know yet if that was true. Ethan appeared in this kitchen doorway. "There's cornbread from this morning and cold beans. That do," May's stomach answered before Clara could. Clara felt the heat rise in her face. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." "Sit down then." They sat at the end of the long plank table. Ethan brought a plate and a cup of milk and set them in front of May without ceremony, and then stood back with his arms crossed and watched the child eat. May ate with the focused, grateful intensity of a child who has learned not to take food for granted, and Clara sat beside her and kept her hands folded in her lap and kept her face composed and did not let herself cry because she had told herself she was not going to do that either, and she had already broken enough promises to herself in the last 3 weeks. When May had finished and her eyes were growing heavy, Ethan said, "There's a room upstairs at the end of the hall. Small 1 bed, but the mattress is clean." "We only need 1 bed," Clara said. He nodded once. "I'll have Hector, that's my foreman, show you to it. Tomorrow morning I want to talk to you about the terms." "The terms? You said you wanted work." "I don't give out charity, Mrs. Whitmore. I expect people to earn what they get, but I'm also not unreasonable." He looked at her steadily. "We'll talk in the morning." "Yes, sir." He called for Hector, a short, weathered man in his 50s, who appeared from somewhere in the back of the house and regarded Clara and May with the careful neutrality of a man withholding judgment, and Hector led them upstairs to the small room at the end of the hall. The bed was narrow, but the blankets were thick, and May was asleep before Clara had finished pulling off the child's boots. Clara sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and listened to her daughter breathe. She was 38 years old. She had buried her husband 4 months ago and watched strangers carry away the furniture she had picked out piece by piece over 12 years of marriage. She had stood in front of a lawyer's desk and been told in careful and impersonal language that James Whitmore's debts exceeded his assets by a significant margin, and that the house, the savings, the horse and cart, and most of the personal property would need to be liquidated to satisfy his creditors. She had nodded and said she understood. She had walked outside and stood on the sidewalk and been unable to remember for a full minute which direction was home. Because home was gone. Because James was gone. Because the people she had thought were her friends, the couples they had dinner with, the women from her sewing circle. The men James played cards with on Thursday nights had one by one found reasons not to be available. First they were busy. Then they were sorry. Then they were simply absent, the way people become absent when the person who needed something had stopped being someone they could afford to know. Clara had taken May and everything she could carry and gotten on the first westbound train that her remaining money could purchase, because west was where people went when everything behind them was gone, and because she had read once that Montana was wide enough that a person could disappear into it and start again. She had not until tonight allowed herself to think about what starting again actually meant. She sat in the dark and listened to May breathe, and looked at the ceiling of Ethan Caldwell's spare room, and allowed herself finally 1 minute of honest reckoning. She was nearly out of money. She had no family within 1,000 miles. She had a 7-year-old daughter who was depending on her entirely. She was in a stranger's house, in a territory she didn't know, and tomorrow morning she was going to have to sit across a table from a man she had met 30 minutes ago and negotiate the terms of her survival. 1 minute, she told herself. Then she lay down beside May, pulled the blanket up over both of them, and closed her eyes. In the morning, she would figure out the rest. Hector came for her at first light. He knocked on the door twice and said, "Mr. Caldwell's at the table, ma'am." And Clara was already dressed. She had been awake since before the sky changed. She had washed her face with cold water from the basin on the dresser and done her hair and put on the cleanest dress she had left, which was not very clean, and she had sat on the edge of the bed and watched May sleeping, and breathed slowly, and made herself ready. She kissed May's forehead and went downstairs. Ethan Caldwell was at the head of the table with a cup of coffee in front of him and nothing else. He did not stand when she entered. He gestured to the chair across from him. Clara sat. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "I'll be honest with you," Ethan said, "because I find it saves time." "So will I," Clara said. Something registered in his face at that not quite surprise, but a slight recalibration. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her. "I run Silver Creek with a crew of 8 men, he said. "We're in the middle of calving season, which means I'm short-handed and short-tempered, and everyone on this ranch is working long days. My cook left 3 weeks ago, took a better offer from a mining camp up north, and I don't blame him. But it means my men are eating badly, and that affects the work." "What was he paid?" Clara asked. Ethan told her. Clara calculated quickly. "I'll cook," she said. 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. I'll manage the kitchen supplies and keep the inventory I can see from the state of your pantry that it needs organizing. If you have accounts that need reviewing, I can do that in the evenings." "That's more than I asked for." "I know, but if I'm going to be here, I want to be useful. I don't do things halfway." He studied her for a moment. "My men won't be gentle with you if they think you're soft." "I'm not soft. You've never worked a cattle ranch. I've managed a household of 12 for a Denver businessman who had 6 children, 3 servants with grudges against each other, and a wife who changed the menu 3 times a week," Clara said. "I've dealt with difficult people in difficult conditions. I'll manage cowboys." His mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the ghost of something that might become one eventually. "There's a condition," he said. "There usually is." He leaned back slightly. "You work here for 30 days. At the end of 30 days we reassess. If the work is satisfactory and you want to stay on, we'll discuss permanent terms. If you want to leave, I'll pay you what you've earned, plus enough to get you and your girl to the next town and started somewhere new." He looked at her directly. "But while you're here, you do the work you said you'd do. You keep your opinions about how I run this ranch to yourself, unless I ask for them, and you—" He paused. "You don't try to fix what belongs to the past." Clara frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means this ranch has a history, and I'm not looking for anyone to rewrite it." His voice was flat and final. "Can you agree to that?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. She didn't know yet what history he was talking about. She didn't know what was in the locked room at the top of the stairs. The one whose door she had noticed as Hector led her past it. The room that was different from the others, where the light didn't reach under the door, because the gap had been stuffed with something where the air around the frame smelled faintly of cedar and old flowers. She didn't know yet what had carved the particular quality of silence into this man. Not the silence of a person who had nothing to say, but the silence of a person who had decided the things they had to say were no longer safe to speak. But she knew what she needed. "Agreed," she said. He put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and told her nothing except that he meant what he said. "Breakfast in an hour," he said, standing. "My men will be in from the night shift. What do they prefer?" He paused in the act of turning away. "Prefer? For breakfast. What do they prefer?" He stared at her. "Nobody's asked them that in a while," he said, and something in the way he said it made her wonder if anybody had ever asked him that either. "I'll find out myself then," Clara said, and went to the kitchen. She found out within the first 3 days what each man at Silver Creek Ranch needed, because Clara Whitmore had learned early in life that feeding people well was half skill and half attention, and she was good at both. Hector the foreman was a man of 53 who had been running cattle since before Clara was born, who had worked for Ethan Caldwell for 9 years, and who had a bad knee that made him walk slightly sideways in cold weather. He drank his coffee black with 3 sugars, and he was the first one up and the last one to bed, and he didn't complain about anything, which Clara recognized as the sign of a man who'd decided complaining was pointless. She started making his coffee before she heard his boots on the stairs. He noticed on the second morning. He came into the kitchen and found the cup already poured and hot, and set at his usual spot at the end of the long kitchen table, and he stood there a moment looking at it, and then he looked at Clara, and something in his face that had been held carefully neutral shifted just slightly. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "You're welcome, Hector." There was Billy Marsh, who was 22 and homesick for Georgia, in a way that came out sideways in the way he went quiet at dinner and picked at his food and stared at nothing. Clara asked him once carefully what his mother cooked on Sunday mornings, and he'd looked at her startled, and then he'd told her biscuits with sorghum and salt pork, and a particular kind of gravy that his grandmother had taught his mother, and that he hadn't eaten in 4 years. Clara couldn't replicate it exactly, but she came close enough that when she set it in front of him on a Sunday morning 2 weeks into her time at the ranch, Billy Marsh ate the whole plate in silence, and then sat for a long moment staring at his hands. "That ain't quite right," he said quietly. "No," Clara agreed. "But it's close, isn't it?" "Close enough to hurt," he said, and that was somehow a compliment. There was Danny Reeves, broad and loud, who laughed at everything and made the other men laugh, and who was the one who had been the most openly skeptical of Clara's arrival. He'd said to Hector within Clara's hearing whether he intended it or not, "Boss is going soft. Last thing a working ranch needs is some city widow underfoot." Clara had said nothing. She had simply made sure that on Danny Reeves's plate every morning for a week there was always more than on everyone else's. Not because she was trying to win him over, but because she'd noticed he worked harder than anyone on the crew and ate the fastest and was often still hungry when the others were done. On the 7th day, Danny came into the kitchen while she was scrubbing pots, and he stood in the doorway, and he said, "You don't have to do that extra. I ain't even been nice to you." "I know," Clara said. "Then why?" "Because you're hungry," she said. "That's enough reason." Danny Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was wrong about you." "I know that too," she said. He laughed a real laugh surprised out of him, and that was the end of his skepticism. May settled into the rhythm of the ranch faster than Clara did. Children are elastic in ways that adults forget, and May Whitmore, who had spent the last 4 months watching her mother hold herself together with visible effort, bloomed in the open air of Silver Creek with a speed that made Clara's chest ache. She followed Hector around the yard, asking questions about everything: the horses, the cattle, the fencing, the particular way the sky looked before a storm. Hector answered every one of them with the patient seriousness of a man who had decided the child deserved real answers. By the end of the first week, May could identify 3 different types of range grass and had named 6 horses without being asked if she could. Ethan watched this. Clara noticed that he watched it. He never said anything about it. He never spoke directly to May, or not often, and when he did, it was brief, functional, the kind of exchange that kept its distance. But he watched her. From across the yard, from the porch, from the corner of the main room, when he came in for supper and found May sitting at the table with a book open in front of her and her tongue between her teeth, and her whole small self concentrated on whatever she was reading, he watched the child the way a man watches something that is causing him pain he can't explain and doesn't want to examine. Clara filed that away and said nothing. She was learning the shape of Ethan Caldwell, the way she had learned the shape of this ranch carefully from a distance, noting what was present and what was conspicuously absent. What was absent, she had catalogued by the end of the first week. No photographs anywhere in the main rooms. No woman's presence of any kind. No sewing left out. No ribbon on a window. No small domestic evidence of anyone having ever shared this space. The kitchen had been a working man's kitchen, purely utilitarian, nothing on the shelves that wasn't for use. Except for one thing. On the top shelf in the kitchen, pushed to the back, almost entirely hidden by a row of tin canisters, was a small blue pitcher. Ceramic painted with a pattern of wildflowers, in yellow and white. It had no business being in that kitchen. It was delicate in the way the rest of the room was not. It had been there a long time, long enough for a fine rim of dust to have gathered on its rim, despite the fact that everything else in the kitchen had been wiped clean. Clara reached up one morning and moved it forward. Not to use it, just to where it could be seen. She noticed Ethan see it that evening when he came in for supper. He didn't say anything, but she heard him stop just inside the kitchen doorway, and the silence had a specific weight to it, and when she glanced back, he was looking at the shelf, and his face had the quality of a man who has been struck by something he didn't see coming. "Would you like me to move it back?" Clara asked. A long pause. "No," he said. He sat down at the table and didn't mention it again. But he looked at it twice more over the course of supper, quick sideways glances, the way a person looks at something they are not ready to look at directly. Clara said nothing. She put food on the table and refilled coffee cups and listened to the men talk and kept her thoughts to herself. But she knew now that the locked room at the top of the stairs was not the only place grief lived in this house. By the end of the second week, Clara had become part of the rhythm of Silver Creek without quite meaning to. It happened the way most real things happen, not in a single moment, but in accumulation. She knew where everything was. She knew the timing of the work. She knew which days were heavy and which had room for breathing. She knew that Wednesday evenings the men played cards at the table in the main room, and that Billy always cheated at poker in a way everyone could see, and nobody called him on, and that Hector made coffee strong enough to dissolve iron when he was the one at the stove, and that Danny Reeves hummed to himself when he was content and went silent when he wasn't. She also knew that Ethan Caldwell ate his dinner alone when the work had been particularly hard. Not isolated, he was in the house at the table, sometimes visible. But there was a quality to his presence on those evenings that kept people at a natural distance, the way heat coming off a stove will make you stand back without deciding to. He was not cruel. He was not cold exactly. He was simply sealed in the way that men are sealed when they've spent years keeping themselves closed and have gotten very good at it. On a Thursday evening, in the middle of the second week, Clara brought him his supper after the other men had finished and gone. She set the plate down and started to leave. "Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore." She paused. "I don't have to, if you'd rather—" "I asked you to sit down." She sat. He looked at his plate for a moment. Then, "You reorganized the supply ledger." "Yes. The previous system wasn't." It was fine. It had 3 separate entries for the same bolt supplier, and 2 of them were billing you at different rates. You were overpaying by nearly $8 a quarter. Silence. $8, he repeated. $8.40 to be precise. He picked up his fork. "Hector said you also told Danny to replace the hinge on the north paddock gate." "The hinge was loose. Another week and it would have failed. The horses in that paddock are your most valuable stock." Ethan swallowed, looked at her. "You've been here 2 weeks. "Yes. You notice a lot." "I always have," she said. "It used to drive my husband mad." She hadn't meant to say that. It came out without warning the way things did sometimes, when she was tired, a piece of James sliding out from somewhere she thought she'd sealed off. She felt her jaw tighten. Ethan looked at her. "What happened to him?" "Heart failure," she said. "He was 41. It was very sudden." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." A pause. "He left you with nothing." The question was blunt, but not unkind. "He left me with May," Clara said, "and a significant education in the unreliability of circumstance." Something flickered in Ethan's face. "That's a particular way to put it. It's a particular situation." He ate in silence for a minute. The fire was low. Through the window, the last of the day's light was going gray. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect? Someone who'd be gone by now." Clara looked at him. "I told you I don't do things halfway." "You did." "Did you believe me?" "Not entirely," he said. "I believe you now." He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like a fact, which, coming from Ethan Caldwell, Clara was beginning to understand, was worth considerably more. The trouble arrived, as trouble does in Montana Territory, in the summer of 1878 without sufficient warning. His name was Gerald Fitch. He arrived at Silver Creek on a Wednesday morning in a good coat and a bad mood, riding a horse too fine for the dust of the territory, with two men who stood slightly behind him and slightly to his left, in the way that men stand when they are paid to be intimidating. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the hooves in the yard. She looked out and watched Ethan walk out from the barn to meet them, and she watched the set of Ethan's shoulders change when he saw who it was. A subtle hardening, almost nothing, but she was beginning to know how to read him. She could not hear the conversation from the kitchen, but she watched it. She watched Fitch gesture broadly at the land around them, the fields, the cattle visible on the lower slope, the fencing lines running out toward the creek. She watched him lean forward slightly when he spoke, the way men lean when they're pressing. She watched Ethan stand exactly still, arms crossed, giving nothing. After 20 minutes, Fitch and his men rode out. Ethan stood in the yard after they were gone and looked at nothing for a long moment. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them out. She handed him one without a word. He took it. They stood in the yard together. "That's Gerald Fitch," he said. "I gathered. He wants to buy this ranch." "He wants to take it," Clara said, and then caught herself. "Forgive me. I don't mean to—" "No." Ethan looked at her. "You're right. He's been after this land for 3 years. He owns everything north and east of here. Silver Creek is the last holding that blocks him from controlling the water access to 3 counties. And you won't sell. Not to him, not at his price. Not for any price if I'm being straight about it." His jaw was set. "This land was my father's." Clara nodded. She didn't say anything else, but she was thinking. She was thinking about the supply ledger she'd reorganized, and the billing discrepancies she'd found, and the inventory records that were 2 months behind where they should be. She was thinking about the cash flow of a cattle ranch that was operating well, but not as efficiently as it could during calving season with an understaffed crew. She was thinking about what it meant to be a man like Ethan Caldwell, with everything he'd lost already, and to have someone now circling what was left. She finished her coffee and went back to the kitchen. And that evening, after supper, without mentioning it to Ethan, she took the account books down from the shelf and started going through them from the beginning. 3 days later, she found it. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing you'd only see if you were looking very carefully, or if you were the kind of woman who had spent years managing household accounts for people who didn't always want the accounts to add up to what they actually were. 2 of Fitch's subsidiary companies, she recognized the names from property documents she'd found folded in the back of the ledger, had been listed as suppliers for Silver Creek. Feed fencing materials, a veterinary service. The billing was legitimate on its face, but the rates had been creeping up small increments every quarter for the past year and a half, and the total overpayment over 18 months came to something that made Clara's eyes stop moving on the page. She sat very still for a moment. Then she went and knocked on the door of Ethan's study. He looked up from where he was working. She came in and put the ledger on the desk in front of him and pointed to the columns one at a time and told him what she'd found and what she calculated the numbers to mean. He looked at the figures for a long time. His face went through several things. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm certain," Clara said. "He's been bleeding money out of this ranch slowly enough that you wouldn't notice quarter to quarter. But over 18 months, it's significant. And if it continues at the rate it's been escalating, the ranch can't sustain it," Ethan said. "No." He sat back. He was very still. "If the ranch goes under," Clara said carefully, "he doesn't have to buy it. He just has to wait." The silence in the study had a new quality now. It was the silence of a man who has seen the shape of something he feared and found it worse than he imagined. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ethan said. "Yes." He looked at her. His face was stripped of its usual careful distance, and what was underneath it was something tired, and something that was not quite gratitude, but was the thing that comes just before it. "You've been here 19 days, he said. "Yes," she said. "And you found what I should have found 2 years ago." She said nothing. "Why?" he said. It was almost not a question. It was the kind of word a person says when they're not sure what they're asking. "Why are you doing this?" Clara picked up the ledger. "Because this ranch deserves to survive," she said. "And because you took us in when you didn't have to, and I pay my debts." She paused in the doorway. "We'll need to replace those suppliers before the next billing cycle. I can help you source alternatives." She left him in his study with the ledger and the lamp and the long understanding of what might have happened to the thing his father built. And she went back to the kitchen, and she put the kettle on, and she sat down at the kitchen table and allowed herself for just a moment to feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Useful. Not just surviving. Useful. It wasn't the same as being safe. It wasn't the same as being happy. But it was something real. And Clara Whitmore, in the middle of her 4th week at Silver Creek Ranch, held onto it like the beginning of a thread that might, if followed carefully, lead somewhere she could not yet see. The morning after Clara showed Ethan the ledger, everything changed. Not loudly. Not the way things change in stories where someone makes a speech and the world rearranges itself around the words. It changed the way the temperature drops before a storm, gradually, measurably, and with the particular quality of something that cannot be undone. Ethan was already at the table when Clara came downstairs. He had the ledger open in front of him, and a second cup of coffee that had gone cold, which meant he'd been there long enough to forget about it, which meant he hadn't slept. Clara took the cold cup without asking, replaced it with a hot one, and started breakfast. He didn't say thank you. But he wrapped both hands around the new cup, and some of the tension across his shoulders shifted, and Clara had been paying enough attention by now to know that was the same thing. Hector came in at 5:30, read the room in approximately 4 seconds, and sat down at the far end of the table with his own coffee and said nothing. Hector had a gift for strategic silence that Clara deeply respected. The other men came in by ones and twos, and breakfast moved the way it always did, loud and fast and hungry. But Ethan didn't eat. He sat at the head of the table with the ledger beside him and his coffee in front of him, and looked at something only he could see. Danny Reeves, who had no gift for strategic silence whatsoever, leaned toward Hector and said not quietly enough, "Boss looks like he got bad news." "Boss had a productive evening," Clara said from the stove without turning around. "Eat your breakfast, Mr. Reeves." Danny ate his breakfast. After the men had gone out, Ethan looked up from the ledger. "You told him to eat his breakfast." "He was about to ask you something you didn't want to answer." A pause. "How do you know what I want?" Clara set a plate in front of him. "I pay attention," she said. "You should eat. Whatever you're planning to do about Fitch, you'll need to think clearly, and you haven't slept." He looked at the plate, then at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat across from him. "I've been through all of it," he said, touching the ledger. "You're right about the numbers. You're right about what he's doing." He stopped. "I should have caught this." "The increases were small," Clara said. "Individually, they're nothing. It's only when you map them across time that the pattern shows." "I should have caught it," he said again, and the way he said it had nothing to do with bookkeeping. Clara looked at him carefully. "Are you angry at yourself or at him?" "Both." He pushed the plate away, then caught himself and pulled it back. "Fitch has been making offers on this land for 3 years, always reasonable on the surface. Always with that particular smile of his that says he already knows how it ends." He stabbed at the food with his fork. "I kept thinking if I just kept the land running, kept the stock strong, he'd find an easier target." "Men like Fitch don't look for easier targets," Clara said. "They look for slower bleeds." Ethan looked at her sharply. "You know men like Fitch." "My husband did business with men like Fitch." She said it evenly. "It didn't end well." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that why?" "Yes," she said, before he could finish asking. "Partly." He didn't push it. He ate 2 bites of food, drank his coffee, looked at the ledger again. "I'm going to ride into town today," he said. "Talk to the county land recorder. If Fitch's companies have been billing me, there's a paper trail. I want to know what that trail looks like before he does." "Take the August invoices," Clara said, "and the ones from February of last year. Those 2 periods show the largest discrepancies. If the recorder needs to see a pattern, those are your clearest evidence. Ethan stared at her. I already marked them, she said. He opened the ledger. The pages she meant were marked with small strips of paper, the relevant figures underlined in pencil. He closed it slowly. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Yes. When this is over, he said, I'm going to need to have a conversation with you about what you're actually worth. Clara picked up her coffee. You can't afford me, she said. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, Ethan Caldwell laughed. It was brief and unpracticed, like something that had been stored somewhere too long and came out slightly rusty. But it was real, and it startled both of them, and in the moment after it faded, something between them settled into a new arrangement. Still careful, still at a distance, but different from what it had been before. Clara stood and collected the plates. She didn't look at him, but she was smiling just slightly, facing the sink, where he couldn't see. He was gone most of the day. Clara managed the ranch in the particular way she had developed over 3 weeks, by being everywhere slightly before she was needed, and nowhere that caused friction. She knew which men could be redirected with a word, and which needed to think they'd made the decision themselves. She knew Hector was the gravitational center of the crew, and that if Hector trusted her, the others followed. Hector trusted her now. She knew it because he'd started consulting her on things that had nothing to do with the kitchen. Small things, operational things. A question about the supply order, a note that one of the younger hands had been writing careless, and whether she thought it was worth mentioning to Ethan or handling it quietly. He asked her opinion the way a person asks someone they consider an equal, without the slight quality of testing that had been in his questions during the first week. May spent the morning in the yard with the horses, which was where she spent most mornings now. Hector had taught her to brush them properly, and she took the responsibility with a seriousness that Clara found both amusing and heartbreaking. The seriousness of a child who has had to be serious for too long and has found in the simple physical task of caring for something a place where being serious actually helped. At noon, Clara brought lunch to the men out in the field, which was not part of her stated duties, and which she'd simply started doing in the second week, because the work was heavy and the walk back to the ranch house for midday was long. She carried it in a basket the way her grandmother used to carry things, and she walked the fence line and handed food to men who accepted it with a particular brand of gruff appreciation that she had come to find against all expectation genuinely touching. Danny Reeves said, "You know you don't have to do this, right?" while taking 3 biscuits with his free hand. "I know," Clara said. "Then why?" "You're going to ask me that every time, aren't you?" "Probably." He grinned. "Still don't have a good answer to it." "Because it needs doing," she said, "and I'm here." She left him with the biscuits and walked back. She was halfway to the house when she heard a horse coming in fast from the direction of the east road, moving at a pace that meant urgency. She stopped and turned. It wasn't Ethan. It was a rider she didn't recognize. Young, maybe 20, with the particular look of someone who'd been riding hard for a while. Hat askew jacket, dusty, coming off the horse before it had fully stopped in the yard. Hector materialized from somewhere the way Hector did, and the young rider spoke to him rapidly. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she saw Hector's face go still in a specific way that made her stop and watch. Hector looked across the yard at her. She walked over. "What is it?" she said. "Message came in at the county office," Hector said. He was choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Caldwell is still in town. There's been the land recorder had some additional questions. Apparently Fitch's lawyer is also in town today." He paused. "That's not coincidental." "No," Clara agreed. "It's not. There's more." Hector handed her a folded paper. "This came in this morning, addressed to Mr. Caldwell, but since it came from the same company—" He nodded at the ledger she'd been working with. "One of the billing names. I thought you should know." Clara unfolded the paper. She read it twice. It was a notice of contract amendment buried in language that took 3 readings to understand clearly from one of Fitch's supply companies. Effective at the end of the current billing cycle, Silver Creek Ranch would be required to pay outstanding balances in full within 30 days, or face a lien claim on property assets. The outstanding balance listed was 4 times what the ledger showed was owed. She folded the paper very carefully. "Hector," she said. "Yes, ma'am. How many men can you spare from the afternoon rotation?" He looked at her. "What for?" "I need to get to town," she said, "and I need someone to stay with May." She rode into Garen's Crossing on Hector's second horse, which was not as fast as she would have liked, and faster than she was comfortable with, because she was not a particularly skilled rider, and Montana roads in late summer had an opinion about that. She didn't care. She arrived at the county land recorder's office with the ledger under her arm, and the false notice in her pocket, and enough focused anger in her chest to heat a room. And she walked through the door, and found Ethan standing at a counter across from a tired-looking man, with a gray mustache and ink on his fingers, with Fitch's lawyer. She knew him immediately, the good suit, the careful posture, the particular expression of a man who has already decided how this ends standing to the side. Everyone looked at her when she came in. Ethan looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected, that he hasn't decided yet whether to be relieved or concerned about. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell." She put the ledger on the counter. She put the folded notice beside it. She looked at the recorder and said, "My name is Clara Whitmore. I manage the accounts at Silver Creek Ranch. I have documentation of 18 months of systematic billing fraud and a fraudulent lien notice dated this morning. I'd like to know if this office is the appropriate place to file a formal complaint, or if I need to go to the Federal Land Office in Helena." The recorder blinked. Fitch's lawyer said very smoothly, "Ma'am, I don't believe I'm not speaking to you," Clara said pleasantly. She kept her eyes on the recorder. "Sir, is this the appropriate office?" The recorder looked at the ledger. He looked at the notice. He looked at Ethan, who was watching Clara with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, a kind of arrested attention, like a man who has been holding his breath without knowing it. "Yes, ma'am," the recorder said. "I believe it is." Fitch's lawyer said, "Now hold on a moment, there's no need to—" "Then I'd like to begin," Clara said, and she opened the ledger to the first marked page. They were there for 2 hours. The recorder was meticulous, which was what the situation required and what Clara had hoped for. He went through every flagged entry. He compared the figures against the original contracts on file, which the recorder had copies of, because contract registration was a county requirement, and which critically showed rates that were measurably lower than what Silver Creek had been billed. Fitch's lawyer argued competently and at length that discrepancies in billing were administrative errors, that the lien notice was a standard contractual protection, that there was no evidence of deliberate intent. Clara said, "The rate increases occurred in increments of approximately 4% per quarter, consistently over 18 months, never exceeding the threshold that would trigger a routine audit. Administrative errors are random. This is a pattern. There is a difference between an accident and a design." The lawyer looked at her. She looked back. "Where did you practice?" he said. "I didn't," she said. "I kept house for a decade and paid attention." He didn't say anything else. By the time they walked out of the county office, the fraudulent lien had been invalidated. The billing discrepancies had been formally flagged for investigation, and the recorder had sent a rider to the federal office in Helena with copies of the documentation. It was not over. Fitch would respond, and Fitch had resources and patience, and a lawyer who was good at his job. But the shape of it had changed. Ethan walked beside her to where the horses were tied, and he said nothing for a long moment, and she let him be silent because she was learning that his silence was where he did his real thinking. "You rode in here," he said finally. "Yes." "On Hector's horse." "Hector offered." "Hector never offers that horse." Clara looked at him. "He was concerned about you." A pause. "He was concerned about the ranch." "Both," she said. "It's possible to be concerned about both." Ethan looked at his boots. He looked at the street. He put his hat back on his head with the particular deliberateness of a man who needs something to do with his hands. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. She felt it land. You rode 20 miles on a horse you barely know, he said, with my accounts under your arm, to go up against a man who has ruined larger ranches than mine. Yes, she said. Why? She looked at him squarely. Because someone should, she said. He held her gaze for a moment that was just slightly longer than necessary. Then he looked away, and when he looked back, his face had returned to its usual careful composition, but something behind his eyes was different. Something had shifted that wouldn't shift back. Ride back with me, he said. They rode back together, mostly in silence, and it was the first time the silence between them felt like something they were sharing rather than something that existed in the space where conversation wasn't. Sound. The evening changed things on the ranch in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. Hector heard the outcome before they'd even dismounted. Someone in town must have talked, and by the time Clara walked into the kitchen to start supper, the men knew. Not the full detail of it, but the shape that Mrs. Whitmore had ridden into Garen's Crossing with the books and done something significant. Danny Reeves was leaning against the kitchen doorway when she walked in. Word is you walked into the county office and took apart Fitch's lawyer with an account ledger, he said. I filed a formal complaint with supporting documentation, Clara said. That's what I said. That is not what you said, he grinned. Billy owes me $2. I told him by the end of the month you'd have done something that made Fitch nervous. Took you 19 days longer than I figured, but I'll take it. You were betting on me. We were all betting on you, he shrugged. Hector said not to, but we did it anyway. Clara set her basket down on the kitchen table. What were the terms? Whether you'd make it 30 days, when you'd decide Fitch was too much trouble. Whether. He stopped. He had the decency to look slightly abashed. Whether the boss had made a mistake taking you on. And now, Danny Reeves looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was entirely unguarded. Now I figure the boss made the best call he's made in about 5 years, he said. And I ain't the only one who thinks it. He went back out before she could respond. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she started making supper. That night after the men had eaten, and May was in bed, Ethan came and stood in the kitchen doorway while Clara was washing the last of the dishes. This had become a pattern in the last week. He didn't always come, but often enough that she'd stop startling when she heard his boots in the hallway. He sat down at the kitchen table. She kept washing. I owe you an apology, he said. She glanced back at him. For what? For the condition I set when you arrived. He looked at his hands on the table. Don't try to fix what belongs to the past. He paused. I meant it as a warning about my personal affairs, but you took it to mean you shouldn't interfere in the ranch's business either. And you did anyway. I interfered because the ranch needed it, she said. Not to make a point. I know that. He looked up. That's what I'm apologizing for. If I hadn't been so guarded about the whole thing, you could have found those discrepancies 3 weeks ago. Clara dried her hands on her apron. She turned around and looked at him. Ethan. He went still at his name. You had no reason to trust me when I arrived, she said. You took in a stranger and her child and gave us work and shelter. The fact that my pride wouldn't let me do less than the full job isn't something you owe me an apology for. I'm not apologizing for doubting you, he said. I'm apologizing for making it harder than it needed to be. That was different. She recognized the difference. She sat down across from him. Tell me about this ranch, she said. Tell me about your father. He looked at her. You said the land was his, she said. You said that like it was the most important thing about why you won't sell. I want to understand. A long pause. My father came to Montana with nothing in 1848, Ethan said. Before there were roads, before there were towns worth talking about. He built Silver Creek with his own hands and 2 horses and a stubbornness that would make a mule look agreeable. Something moved in his voice, not grief exactly, but the thing that lives in the same neighborhood. He always said the land was honest, that it gave back what you put into it Fair measure, no more and no less. He said that was more than most people managed. Did you believe him? I do now. He looked at the table. He died 6 years ago. Left the ranch to me and the deed clear and a note that said don't sell to fools or cowards. He stopped. I've been trying to honor that. You are honoring it, Clara said. He looked at her sharply. The land is still yours, she said. You've kept it through 6 years, and a drought, and a man who's been trying to starve you out. That's honoring it. He was quiet. You know what my father would have made of you, he said after a moment. What? He'd have said you were the kind of woman this territory was built by. He said it simply, without decoration. The kind who sees what needs doing, and does it, and doesn't spend time worrying about whether it's proper. Clara looked at her hands in her lap. She didn't say anything. I meant that as a compliment, he said. I know, she said. I'm just deciding how to hold it. He nodded like that was a reasonable thing. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it testing the window frames, the particular sound of a Montana summer night, remembering that winter was not very far away. Inside the kitchen, the fire was banked low, throwing warm light across the table between them. It was, Clara thought, the most comfortable she had felt in 4 months. That frightened her considerably. She stood up. Good night, Ethan. He stood too. Good night, Clara. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark beside her sleeping daughter and listened to the wind, and thought about the way her name had sounded in his voice, steady, deliberate, like something he meant. She thought about James, about the house in Denver, about the particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself but lives in the small spaces of ordinary days, the pause before you reach for a cup you use to share the instinct to tell someone something, and the immediate hollow of remembering you can't. She had thought when she left Denver that she was running from grief. She was beginning to understand she'd been carrying it all along. The following morning brought something no one at Silver Creek had been expecting. Gerald Fitch came back. Not with his lawyer this time. He came alone, which was in some ways more alarming. Men who bring lawyers are negotiating. Men who come alone have already decided. He arrived while Ethan was out checking the east fence line, and Clara was the only one near the house. She heard the horse, came to the door, and found Fitch dismounting in the yard with the easy confidence of a man who has rehearsed this particular entrance. He was in his 50s, heavier than he looked at a distance, with a silver watch chain and a smile that knew what it was doing. He looked at Clara with a brief calibrating assessment and then said, I'm looking for Caldwell. He's out, Clara said. And you are? Someone who works here, she said. Fitch studied her for a moment. The smile didn't change, but something behind it did. You're the widow, he said. Word travels in a county this small. Does it? You caused some trouble at the recorder's office yesterday. I filed a legal complaint, Clara said. I understand those are different things. Fitch stepped closer. Not threateningly, he was too polished for that, but deliberately in the way of a man establishing the terms of a conversation. You're smart, he said. Smarter than I was told, and I imagine you're loyal to Caldwell right now because he's been good to you. He paused. But loyalty's a commodity like anything else, and I imagine a woman in your situation thinks about the future. Every day, Clara said. Then think about this. He reached into his coat. She didn't flinch, though some part of her wanted to, and produced a folded envelope. Caldwell won't take my offer for the ranch, but I'm prepared to offer a secondary arrangement. Help me understand the operational state of this property, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, and when I do acquire this land, I'll ensure you're well compensated for the transition. He held out the envelope. Clara looked at it. She looked at him. Mr. Fitch, she said. Yes. This ranch took in my daughter and me when we had nowhere else to go, she said. The man who owns it hasn't asked me for a single thing I wasn't willing to give. He treated me like I was worth trusting before I'd earned it. She stepped back from the door. I'd rather starve in a ditch than take $1 from you. Fitch's smile went from calibrated to something colder. That's a romantic position, Mrs. Whitmore. Romantic positions don't tend to survive a Montana winter. Neither do men who underestimate what women are capable of, she said, and she closed the door. She stood just inside it for a moment, her heart going hard and fast in her chest. Then she crossed to the kitchen, picked up the nearest thing she could find, which happened to be a dish towel, and gripped it very hard until her hands stopped shaking. She heard the horse leave the yard. She put the dish towel down. She went to find Hector. Ethan heard about it from Hector before he'd gotten all the way across the yard. He came into the house fast, and Clara was at the stove, and he said, "Clara," in a voice that had a different quality to it, entirely. Tight, urgent, with an undertone of something she hadn't heard from him before. "I'm all right," she said immediately. "He came here alone." "Yes." "He offered you? What did he offer you?" "Money, and a comfortable transition once he took the ranch." She turned to face him. "I declined." Ethan was looking at her with that arrested expression again, the one she was beginning to recognize as Ethan Caldwell, trying to calculate something that didn't have a clear equation. "He threatened you. He implied the future was uncertain," she said. "Men like that always do. It's the part of the strategy that comes before the obvious threat." "Clara, I'm not frightened of him," she said. And then, because it was true, and because Ethan looked like he needed to hear the truth, "I was for about 45 seconds after I closed the door, and then I stopped." He stared at her. "He wanted me to feel small," she said. "I've had practice not letting people do that." Ethan crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He didn't touch her. He stopped just short of her, close enough that she could see the specific quality of tension in his face, fury, she thought, and under it something that was not about Fitch at all. "You should have sent for me," he said. "There wasn't time, and I handled it." "That's not—" He stopped. "I don't want you handling things like that alone. Ethan." She kept her voice level. "I handled it. It's done. What matters now is what he does next, because a man like that doesn't make a direct approach like that unless he's changing strategies. He's been patient for 3 years. He's not patient anymore." A beat. The fury in his face moved to the side, and his mind came to the front, and she watched him make the shift from protective to tactical, with a speed that told her that was his native mode when he allowed himself to use it. "He's running out of time," Ethan said slowly. "Yes, the investigation at the recorder's office means the billing manipulation stops. Without that income stream, his plan to wait out the ranch doesn't work. He has to move faster now, which means he'll try something more direct." "Yes." He looked at her. "What would you do? Me. If you were him, what would you do?" Clara thought about it. "I'd find something that couldn't be filed at a recorder's office," she said. "Something that made the ranch untenable to operate rather than just unprofitable. Access to water, the cattle stock itself, or—" She stopped. "Or what?" She looked at him directly. "Or the people." A silence. "I'll send Billy into town tomorrow," Ethan said. "And I want everyone working in pairs until this is resolved." "Including May," Clara said. His eyes met hers. "Including May," he confirmed, and the way he said it without hesitation, with the same weight as any of the men made, something shift inside her chest that she wasn't entirely prepared for. She turned back to the stove. "Supper's in 20 minutes, she said, because that was the kind of thing you said when the alternative was saying something you hadn't decided yet whether you were ready to mean. Behind her, Ethan didn't move for a moment. Then she heard him cross to the table and sit down, and the kitchen settled into its familiar rhythm. And outside, the wind moved across the fields, and Silver Creek Ranch held itself together under the weight of everything that was coming, waiting, the way a thing waits when it knows the test is real, and it has decided finally to face it. The pairing system Ethan ordered went into effect the next morning without argument, which told Clara more about how seriously the men took the Fitch situation than anything they might have said out loud. Nobody complained. Nobody asked why. Hector organized the rotations before breakfast was finished, and by the time the sun was fully up, every man at Silver Creek was working with a partner, and every post on the property had 2 sets of eyes on it. Danny Reeves, who had never in Clara's experience moved quietly about anything, pulled on his jacket and went out with Billy Marsh and said nothing at all. That was how she knew they were afraid, not panicked. Cowboys in Montana Territory didn't panic easily, but the particular focused quiet that settled over the crew that morning had weight to it, and Clara moved through it carefully, the way you move through a room where something fragile has been placed somewhere unexpected. May ate breakfast without asking questions, which meant she understood more than Clara wanted her to. After the men went out, Clara sat across from her daughter and said, "How are you, sweetheart?" May looked up from her biscuit. "Is the bad man going to come back?" Clara kept her face steady. "What bad man?" "The one with the silver buttons," May said. "Hector told me not to go near him if he came in the yard. He said it real quiet, like he didn't want anyone to hear." She looked at her mother with those dark eyes that had always seen too much. "But I heard." Clara reached across the table and covered May's hand with hers. "Hector was being careful," she said. "That's all. Is Mr. Caldwell going to be all right?" Clara looked at her daughter. 7 years old, with her father's serious mouth and her mother's habit of going straight to the question everyone else was walking around. "Yes," Clara said. "How do you know?" "Because we're going to help make sure he is." May considered this. Then she nodded with the particular gravity of a child who has decided to trust something and went back to her biscuit. Clara went back to her coffee. She sat with it for a long moment after May had gone out to find Hector, and she thought about what she'd just said, "We're going to help make sure he is," and she noticed without quite meaning to how naturally the word "we" had come. Not I, not you. We. When had that happened? She didn't have a good answer. She got up and washed the dishes. Billy came back from a town by mid-morning with information and a face that said it was not good information. He found Clara first, which had become without anyone deciding it the pattern. He came into the kitchen and took his hat off and turned it in his hands and said, "There's talk in town, ma'am." "What kind of talk?" "The kind Fitch started." Billy was not a complicated young man, which was one of the things Clara appreciated about him. He said what he meant without needing to be extracted. "Word going around is that Mr. Caldwell's operation is in financial trouble, that the county investigation is going to turn up problems on both sides, that—" He stopped. He looked at his hat. "That you're the one who's been cooking the books." The kitchen went very quiet. "Me?" Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." She set down the cup she was holding. She did it carefully so it wouldn't make a sound. "He's saying I've been manipulating the accounts. Saying you came on the ranch under false pretenses." Billy's jaw was tight. "Saying you're not actually a widow, or that you are, but that your husband's debts followed you west and you've been—" He stopped again. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm just telling you what I heard." "I know," she said. "You did right. Keep going. Saying you've been falsifying records to make his companies look bad and cover up problems that were already in Silver Creek's books before you got here." He looked up. 3 men at the feed store were talking about it like it was settled fact. Clara stood at the kitchen table and thought about Gerald Fitch, and thought about how a man who had been patient for 3 years and was now running out of time would spend the days after a woman walked into a county recorder's office and dismantled his billing scheme with a pencil and a ledger. He would do exactly this. He would take the one thing she'd used against him and turn it back around. "Where's Ethan?" she said. "Came in right behind me," Billy said. "He's in the yard." She walked out. Ethan was standing by the fence with Hector, and he looked at her when she came through the door, and something in her face told him immediately, because his expression changed before she'd said a word. "Billy told you," he said. "Yes." "I heard it at the south pasture," he said. "2 of the Reston brothers were talking about it, loud enough to be certain I could hear." His voice was even. His eyes were not. "This is his answer to the recorder's office. He's fast, Clara said. He's been thinking about this for 3 years, Ethan said. He has contingencies. Then we need to be faster. She looked at him directly. The original contracts. The ones on file at the county office showing the billing rates before his companies started manipulating them. If those predate my arrival at Silver Creek by 18 months, then the false numbers existed before I ever touched your books. That's documentary evidence that directly contradicts what he's saying. Ethan looked at her. The recorder has those on file, she said. We established that yesterday. What we need is a written statement from the recorder confirming the timeline that the discrepancies originated before my arrival, and that I identified them rather than created them. And if Fitch has gotten to the recorder, it was a real question, and she took it seriously. Then we go to Helena, she said. We go to the federal land office with the original documentation, and we go over Fitch's head entirely. Hector, who had been listening to all of this with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, said, "That's a 4-day ride." "I know," Clara said, "and in 4 days with this kind of talk circulating in town." "I know," she said again. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at her with that expression she'd been trying to put a name to for 3 weeks. Not the arrested attention of a man who didn't know what to think. Something more deliberate than that. Something that had made a decision she wasn't yet aware of. "I believe you," he said. Just that. Not an explanation. Not a list of reasons. 3 words said in the same tone he used for facts he'd already settled. Clara felt them land somewhere in the center of her chest. "I know you do," she said. "The men believe you too," Hector said. In case that wasn't clear. She looked at the foreman. "Even with what Fitch is saying." "Ma'am," Hector said with a precision that was its own kind of warmth. "We've watched you work for 23 days. A man who's worked cattle his whole life knows the difference between someone who's scheming and someone who's pulling their weight." He paused. "You've been pulling more than your weight." She looked away for a moment. Not because she was going to cry. Because she had learned over the last 4 months that the moment she let gratitude fully in was the moment she lost the ability to keep functioning, and right now she needed to keep functioning. "All right," she said. "Here's what we do." The plan they settled on was not simple and not safe, but it was the best one available given the terrain. Ethan would ride for Helena, not in 4 days tomorrow morning. He would take the documentation the recorder's copies, if the recorder would provide them, and make the case to the federal land office before Fitch had time to establish his false narrative with anyone who mattered at that level. Hector would stay and run the ranch in his absence. Clara would manage the books and continue establishing the paper trail with every transaction. And Clara would do one more thing. "I want to talk to people in town," she said. Ethan looked at her sharply. "That's not—" "The damage Fitch is doing is social," she said. "Legal documentation answers legal accusations. But the talk at the feed store isn't legal, it's personal. The only thing that answers it is presence." She met his eyes. "I want to go into Garen's Crossing and buy supplies the way I always do with the ranch accounts and let people see me doing it. Let them ask questions if they want to. And if they're hostile, then they're hostile." She kept her voice steady. "I didn't come this far to hide in a kitchen because someone told lies about me in a feed store." A silence. "Take Danny with you," Ethan said. "I was going to ask Hector if he could spare him." "He can," Hector said. Ethan looked at Clara for a long moment. The muscle in his jaw worked once the way it did when he was closing down an argument he hadn't fully finished making. "Be careful," he said. "I'm always careful," she said. "You rode into the county office with my account books under your arm." "That was calculated," she said. "There's a difference." The corner of his mouth moved. She was learning to watch for that. "Go do your errands," he said. And then quietly, so only she could hear, "Don't let them make you small." She looked up at him. "You either," she said. He held her gaze for a moment that was slightly longer than the situation required, and slightly shorter than she might have wanted. And then he turned and went to see about the horses. Garen's Crossing. In the middle of a Wednesday was not a hostile place by nature, but Clara felt the shift the moment she walked into the general store with Danny Reeves at her shoulder. It was not obvious. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. But there was a particular quality to the silence that happened when the two women who had been talking near the dry goods section stopped talking, and a particular quality to the way the man behind the counter looked at her and then looked at the counter. Danny felt it too. She could tell by the way he straightened and the way his hand moved slightly closer to his side, not to his gun. Danny was not a stupid man, but to his belt, a habitual gesture that said, "I am paying attention." Clara walked to the counter. "Good morning," she said. The man behind the counter. His name was Rourke. She'd dealt with him before, a broad man in his 40s who kept a fair establishment and had always been pleasant enough, looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "I have the usual order for Silver Creek," she said. She put the list on the counter. "If you'd like, I can wait while you fill it, or I can come back in an hour." Rourke looked at the list. He didn't pick it up. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and something in his tone told her she was not going to like what came next. "I've been hearing some things this morning." "I imagine you have," she said. "About the accounts, about some irregularities." "The irregularities in Silver Creek's accounts," Clara said clearly, and she said it at a volume that was appropriate for the size of the store and would carry, "were created by Gerald Fitch's billing companies over a period of 18 months, beginning before I arrived at the ranch. I identified them. I documented them. I filed a formal complaint with the county recorder's office 2 days ago with full supporting documentation. The federal land office in Helena has been notified." She paused. "I am happy to let anyone who has questions about that review the original records. They're on file." The store was very quiet. One of the women by the dry goods had turned around. Rourke looked at her. He was recalculating something. She could see it happening. "Gerald Fitch has been operating in this county for 7 years. Clara continued, still at that same clear, even volume. "He has been systematically acquiring land by making operations financially unsustainable through methods that are now under federal investigation. Silver Creek Ranch is not the first property he's tried this with." She looked at Rourke steadily. "I suspect it won't be the last unless someone stops him. We're trying to stop him." A long silence. Then one of the women by the dry goods said, "My brother sold his property to Fitch 2 years ago." Clara looked at her. She was in her 60s, sharp-faced, with the kind of eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by much. "He sold because he couldn't make the payments on a feed contract that kept going up," the woman said. "I always thought that was strange." "What was the name of the company on the contract?" Clara asked. The woman told her. Clara recognized it. It was one of the names from Silver Creek's ledger. The store was absolutely quiet now. Rourke picked up Clara's list. "Give me an hour," he said. They rode back to Silver Creek with the supplies, and with something more valuable than supplies, the particular knowledge that Fitch's strategy had a weakness, which was that he had been doing this for a long time, and the people he'd done it to were still in the county and still remembered. Clara spent the afternoon writing. Not account records letters. She wrote to the woman from the general store whose name was Agnes Tolliver, asking if she could obtain the details of her brother's contract. She wrote to 2 other ranchers she'd heard mentioned in town, whose operations had declined in the last 3 years. She wrote carefully, factually, without drama, laying out what she knew, and what she could prove, and what she was asking for. She wrote 4 letters, and gave them to Billy to post in the morning. Then she went and stood in the hallway outside the locked room at the top of the stairs. She had walked past it every day for 3 weeks. She had never touched the door. Ethan's condition, "don't try to fix what belongs to the past," had been clear, and she had respected it because she understood what it meant to have something you weren't ready to open. But she stood there now in the late afternoon quiet, and she thought about what Billy had reported from town, and what Agnes Tolliver had said about her brother, and what Ethan had said about his father building this land with nothing and 2 horses, and a stubbornness that would make a mule look agreeable. She thought about the locked room and the dead garden and the blue pitcher she'd moved to the front of the shelf. She was not going to open the door, but she put her hand flat against it briefly, the way you put your hand against something to feel if it's warm. It was just wood. She took her hand away and went downstairs. Ethan left for Helena before sunrise. He came into the kitchen while Clara was making his travel provisions, and he stood in the doorway and looked at her and said, "I should be back in 6 days, maybe 5 if the road's clear." "I'll manage," she said. "I know you will." He took the wrapped provisions she handed him. "That's not what I'm—" He stopped, started again. "If Fitch makes a move while I'm gone— Hector's here, the men are paired. I have your accounts in order and your lawyer's name and address in my apron pocket." She looked at him. "What are you actually worried about?" He looked at her for a long moment. "You," he said simply. The words sat between them without decoration. "I'll be here when you get back," she said. Her voice was even. "I'm counting on it," he said. He put on his hat, picked up his saddlebag, and walked out. She heard his boots on the porch, and then the sound of the horse, and then nothing. She stood in the kitchen and held very still for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove. The first 2 days without Ethan were manageable. The third day, everything came apart. It started with the cattle. Hector came in from the north pasture at mid-morning, and the look on his face was the look of a man delivering information he wishes he didn't have. He came straight to Clara, which told her how serious it was. "North herd," he said. "About 40 head. They're sick." Clara stopped what she was doing. "How sick?" "Don't know yet. Doc Reeves not Danny the animal doctor over in Millbrook he's been sent for. But they were fine yesterday, and this morning they're not, and the ones that are worst are the ones closest to the creek outlet." Clara was very still. "The creek outlet?" "Yes." She thought about what she'd said to Ethan 4 days ago. "I'd find something that couldn't be filed at a recorder's office. Something that made the ranch untenable to operate rather than just unprofitable. The cattle stock itself. Or the people." "Hector," she said, "I need you to pull every animal away from the creek outlet. Right now, all of them. Not just the north herd everything." He looked at her. "Please," she said. "I'll explain in a moment. Just do it first." He went. She went to the kitchen shelf and pulled down every jar of stored water she'd had Billy fill 3 days ago for the house supply. She'd started doing it as routine. Something her grandmother had taught her: always keep stored water that doesn't come from the same source as the working supply. She lined them up on the table. Then she went out to the creek outlet with a tin cup. The water looked fine. Water that has been tampered with usually looks fine. She brought the cup inside and set it next to the stored jars, and looked at it for a long time. And then she did something she had not done since Denver, since the lawyer's office, since the day she understood that the life she'd built was gone. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands. Not crying. She was past crying. She was thinking. Because she knew this. She recognized this particular move. It was not about killing cattle. You didn't need to kill cattle to accomplish what Fitch wanted to accomplish. You needed people to believe the land itself was turning against a struggling operation. You needed the story to be, Silver Creek can't sustain itself. The herd is sick. The water may be bad. Caldwell's been fighting a losing battle for years, and now look. You needed just enough truth to make the rest of the lie hold. She lifted her head. She was not going to let this ranch go under because a man in a good coat had decided it should. She stood up. The animal doctor arrived from Millbrook by late afternoon and confirmed what Clara had already begun to suspect: the cattle showed signs of mineral poisoning, consistent with exposure to a particular compound that occurred naturally in the territory, but in concentrations. This specific and this sudden. He pursed his lips, were unlikely to be natural. He gave her a name for it. He gave her a treatment. He told her honestly that they might lose some of the affected animals. Clara thanked him and asked him to write everything down. His findings, his assessment, his opinion on whether the concentration was natural or introduced. She watched his face as she asked. He was a practical man. He understood what she was asking and why. He wrote it down and signed it. She added it to the growing folder of documents she had started keeping under the floorboard in her room, the same place she'd always kept important papers since James died, a habit born from the understanding that paper was the only thing that stood between what was true and what someone decided to say was true. Danny Reeves came to her that evening with his jaw set and his eyes hard. "Someone did that," he said, not a question. "Almost certainly," Clara said. "Then someone needs to answer for it." "They will," she said. "But not tonight, and not the way you're thinking." Clara. He almost never used her name. "We've got sick cattle, and a boss who's 4 days away, and a man who's been lying about us all over the county. At what point do we stop being patient?" "When we have everything we need," she said, "not before. If we move now without Ethan here and without the full documentation, Fitch's lawyer will make us look like the problem. We'll be the hotheads who reacted. He'll be the man defending himself." She looked at Danny steadily. "I know it's hard. I know waiting feels wrong. But the way we win this is clean. We win it so completely that there's nothing left for him to argue." Danny was quiet for a long moment. "My daddy used to say patience was the hardest work there was," he said finally. "Your daddy was right." He nodded. He went out. Clara went and sat with May until the little girl fell asleep, and then she sat in the dark for a while, just breathing, just holding the weight of everything, before she went back downstairs. The letter came on the 4th day. It wasn't from Ethan. It was from Agnes Tolliver, the woman from the general store, and it was 3 pages long and written in a hand that shook slightly with age, but not with uncertainty. Agnes had her brother's original contract. She had found 2 other former property owners in the county who recognized the billing company names. One of them, a man named Porter, who had sold his homestead to Fitch 2 years ago, had kept his records and was willing to speak to whoever was going to Helena. Clara read the letter twice. Then she sat down and wrote 3 letters in rapid succession to Agnes to Porter, and a 4th letter to Ethan in Helena, sent care of the Federal Land Office, telling him what she had and what she needed him to ask for. She was sealing the 4th letter when Hector came in. His face told her something had happened. "Billy's back from town," he said. Billy came in behind him. He was trying to keep his face neutral and failing. "What?" Clara said. "Fitch's lawyer filed papers this morning," Billy said. "At the county office. He's claiming the billing investigation was initiated based on falsified evidence. He's named you specifically." He paused. "He's petitioned the county judge to compel you to appear." Clara looked at the letter in her hand. "The one addressed to Ethan." "When?" she said. "Day after tomorrow." The silence in the kitchen was very specific. Clara set the letters down on the table. She put her hands flat on the surface on either side of them. She breathed once slowly. "All right," she said. "All right," Billy repeated. "Yes." She looked up. "If they want me to appear, I'll appear. That's what courts are for." She looked at Hector. "How many of the original billing records do we have on site?" "All of them," Hector said. "You made copies of everything before Ethan took the originals." "Yes, I did," she said. "Get them, all of them. We're going to spend tonight organizing them in the order a judge would want to see them, and the day after tomorrow, I'm going to walk into that courthouse, and I'm going to answer every single question they have." Hector looked at her. Something in his face had moved past professional respect into something quieter and more personal. "You've done this before," he said. "No," she said. "But I've been cleaning up other people's messes my entire life. I'm reasonably good at it by now." She picked up the letters and handed them to Billy. "Post these tonight," she said, "and send a rider to Helena with the one on top. It needs to reach Mr. Caldwell before tomorrow morning if possible." Billy looked at the letters. "This is it, isn't it?" he said. "This is where it either goes our way or it doesn't." "Yes," Clara said. "What are the odds?" She looked at him steadily. "Better than they were a month ago," she said. "And better tomorrow than today. That's the best I can tell you." He nodded. He went. Clara stood at the kitchen table with Hector, and the fire going low behind her, and the folder of documents in front of her, and the night outside pressing in from all directions. And she thought about Ethan riding toward Helena with the first set of proof in his saddlebag, and about Agnes Tolliver with her brother's records, and about the animal doctor's signed statement under the floorboard upstairs. And she thought about a 38-year-old widow who had arrived at a stranger's gate 3.5 weeks ago with blistered feet and 14 cents, and a daughter who hadn't eaten since the day before. She thought about how far that woman had come. And then she opened the folder and got to work. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid, or not only because of that, but because there was too much to do and too little time to do it in. And Clara Whitmore had learned years ago that fear was most dangerous when it had nothing to occupy it. Give it work instead, and it became something closer to fuel. So she worked. Hector stayed with her until past midnight, spreading documents across the kitchen table, sorting by date by company, name by transaction. Type building the kind of clear sequential record that left no room for interpretation. Hector turned out to have a precise and orderly mind that had been entirely wasted on cattle schedules, and he sorted papers with the focused efficiency of a man who had understood from the moment Billy walked in with the news that this was the thing that mattered most. At one point, around 11 o'clock, he said without looking up from the papers, "My first boss man named Aldridge ran a spread up near the Blackfoot River, lost his land to a man just like Fitch. Different name. Same coat." He smoothed a document flat with the side of his hand. Aldridge was a good man. Worked that land 30 years. Lost it in 8 months. "What happened to him?" Clara asked. "Went to work for someone else," Hector said. "Never was the same after." Clara looked at him. "That's not going to happen here," he said. "It was not a comfort. It was a decision." "No," she said. "It isn't." They kept working. By 1 in the morning, they had 3 separate organized stacks: the billing fraud documentation, the cattle poisoning evidence, including the animal doctor's signed statement, and what Clara was privately calling the pattern file, which included Agnes Tolliver's letter, Porter's records, and her own written summary connecting Fitch's companies across multiple properties in the county over 5 years. That last stack was the one that made her hands steady when she looked at it. Any single piece of what they had could be argued around. All of it together was a different thing entirely. At 1:30, Hector made fresh coffee and set a cup in front of her and said, "You should try to rest for a few hours." "So should you." "I'm 53 years old, and I've been sleeping light since 1861, he said. "A few hours on the kitchen bench suits me fine. You've got to stand in front of a judge in the morning." She looked at him. "Hector, why are you so loyal to this ranch?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. "Because Ethan Caldwell hired me when nobody else would," he said simply. "I was coming off a bad stretch. Made some choices I'm not proud of." He looked at my references, which were thin, and he looked at me, and he said, "You know what?" he said. "What?" He said, "A man's past is his own business. What I care about is what he does next." Hector looked up. "Been here 9 years. Clara sat with that for a moment. Then she went upstairs and lay down beside May and closed her eyes and, against all expectation, slept. She was up before the light again. May was already awake, sitting up in the bed with her knees pulled to her chest, watching Clara dress with the particular expression she got when she was trying to decide whether to say something. "Say it," Clara said. "Are you going to win?" May asked. Clara buttoned her collar, looked at her daughter in the mirror. "I'm going to tell the truth in front of a judge," she said. "That's what I'm going to do. And the truth is on our side. That's the best position there is." "But is it enough?" Clara turned around. She crossed to the bed and sat on the edge of it and looked at May directly. "I don't know," she said. "I won't lie to you about that. But I know that doing nothing is worse. And I know that we didn't come all the way from Denver to be beaten by a man like Gerald Fitch." May looked at her for a long moment. "Daddy would have said you're being fierce." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "What do you think?" I think he was right, May said. Can I come with you? No. Mama, you're staying with Hector and Danny and Billy, who will make sure you're safe. And when I come back... She paused. She made herself say the second half of that sentence without qualifying it. When I come back, I'll tell you everything. May nodded. She reached out and straightened Clara's collar, a precise and adult gesture that made Clara's throat tighten in ways she didn't have time for. You look like someone important, May said. Clara kissed her forehead. Good, she said. That's exactly what I'm going for. The courthouse in Garen's Crossing was a single-story building with a good solid door and a smell of old paper and linseed oil that Clara found unexpectedly steadying. She knew the smell of records. She knew the smell of official things. This was her territory in ways that a cattle pasture or a fence line was not, and she walked in with the document folder under her arm and her chin level, and Danny Reeves 3 steps behind her, like a man who had appointed himself her personal shadow and was not open to discussion on the matter. The county judge was named Harlan Webb. He was 60 lean with the kind of face that had spent decades hearing people argue and had arrived at a permanent expression of reserved assessment. He looked at Clara when she came in, and he looked at her folder, and he looked at Fitch's lawyer, a man named Casserly, who was already seated, and who acknowledged Clara's entrance with the brief, confident nod of a man who expected to win. And then Judge Webb said, "Let's keep this orderly, and let's keep it brief." Casserly went first. He was good. Clara had known he was good, and she watched him work with the detached attention of a person studying a technique they intend to counter. He laid out the petition smoothly. The county investigation, he said, had been initiated on the basis of records that had been altered or fabricated by an individual. Mrs. Clara Whitmore, who had arrived at Silver Creek Ranch under unclear circumstances and had since gained inappropriate access to financial records. He said the billing discrepancies in question were administrative in nature and had been misrepresented. He said the entire investigation was built on a foundation that did not hold. He said all of it without raising his voice or making a single claim that wasn't technically defensible as a position, and Clara watched Judge Webb's face as he listened and could not read it, which was either a good sign or a bad one. When it was her turn, she stood up. She put the folder on the table in front of her, and she opened it, and she began. She did not argue. She did not match Casserly's manner, or his speed, or his professional smoothness. She simply presented. Document by document, date by date, company name by company name. She spoke clearly and without decoration, and she answered the judge's questions when he asked them, and he asked several sharp and specific questions that told her he had been listening much more carefully than his face suggested. She presented the original contracts on file at the county recorder's office showing baseline rates. She presented the quarterly billing statements showing the incremental increases. She presented her own calculation of the timeline, which showed that the manipulation had begun 21 months before her arrival at Silver Creek. Then she put Agnes Tolliver's letter on the table. Then Porter's records. Then the animal doctor's signed statement regarding the cattle. Judge Webb looked at the animal doctor's statement for a long time. "This alleges deliberate contamination," he said. "Yes, Your Honor." "That's a serious allegation." "Yes, Your Honor. I wouldn't make it without the documentation to support it." Casserly said, "Your Honor, this is entirely speculative." "Mr. Casserly," Judge Webb said in the tone of a man who has said that particular name, that particular way before, "I'm looking at a veterinary report signed by Dr. James Howell of Millbrook, who has practiced in this county for 11 years, and whose professional opinion I have had cause to rely on previously. If you'd like to challenge his findings, I suggest you do so in a separate proceeding." He looked back at Clara. "Continue, Mrs. Whitmore." Casserly's jaw tightened. He said nothing else. Clara continued. She was on the pattern file walking the judge through the 5-year history of Fitch's companies and the properties adjacent to theirs that had been sold under financial pressure when the door opened. She didn't look up immediately. She was mid-sentence, and she had learned that stopping mid-sentence in front of a judge was a tactical error. But she heard the footsteps. heard them stop, and then she heard a voice she recognized say, "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I own Silver Creek Ranch. I have documents from the Federal Land Office in Helena that I believe are directly relevant to this proceeding." Clara looked up. He was travel-worn in a way that meant he had ridden through the night. His coat was dusty and his jaw was unshaven, and he was carrying a saddlebag over one shoulder and a folder that matched the one she'd given him 6 days ago. He looked at her first, before the judge, before Cassidy, before anyone else in the room. She looked back. Something passed between them in that look that had no name yet but needed one. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Webb said, "you have impeccable timing." "I had a good letter, Your Honor," Ethan said. He was still looking at Clara. "Someone told me exactly where to be and exactly what to bring." Judge Webb gestured to the table. "Sit down and show me what you have." What Ethan had brought from Helena was in the particular language of legal documentation devastating. The Federal Land Office had records going back further than the county office property transfers, original title grants, water rights registrations. And what those records showed, assembled alongside what Clara had built from the Silver Creek Ledger and Agnes Tolliver's letter and Porter's files, was not simply billing manipulation at one ranch. It was a systematic acquisition strategy applied across 7 properties in 3 counties over 6 years. The same companies, the same incremental billing increases, the same pattern of financial pressure followed by a purchase offer at below market value. 3 of those properties had sold. 4, including Silver Creek, had not yet. Ethan laid each document down on the table in front of the judge with the particular calm of a man who has made a long, hard ride and has arrived with exactly what he came for. Cassidy said at one point, "Your Honor, my client is not party to this. Your client's companies are named in federal records as party to 7 of these transactions," Judge Webb said, and something in his voice had changed, not louder, but denser, with a quality of finality that Clara recognized from men who have stopped listening to arguments and started writing conclusions. "I will hear your objection in full after I've reviewed this documentation." Cassidy sat back. He was still composed. He was professional to the end. Clara would give him that. But there was something different in the quality of his stillness now. It was the stillness of a man doing rapid calculations. After 2 hours, Judge Webb called a recess. After the recess, he came back, and he looked at Cassidy and said, "I am referring this matter to the Federal Land Court in Helena, with a full recommendation for investigation into the activities of Mr. Gerald Fitch and his associated companies across 3 counties. The lien petition against Silver Creek Ranch is denied. The county investigation into the Silver Creek accounts is confirmed as valid and will proceed. And I want Dr. Howell's report on the cattle contamination forwarded to the Territorial Sheriff's Office this afternoon." He closed the folder on his desk. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Yes, Your Honor. Your documentation was exemplary." He said it the way judges say things, as a statement of fact without warmth, which somehow made it more meaningful than warmth would have. "You may go." The light outside was sharp and late afternoon golden when they walked out, and Clara stood on the courthouse steps and breathed the open air and felt the accumulated weight of the last 6 days begin to release from her shoulders, in stages like a load being set down carefully rather than dropped. Danny Reeves, who had waited outside the entire 2 hours, took one look at her face and said, "We won." "We're winning," she said. "There's more to come." But yes. Danny tilted his head back and said something to the sky that Clara chose not to repeat, and it was loud enough that 2 men passing on the street turned to look, and Clara didn't care in the least. Ethan came out behind her. He stood beside her on the steps, and they both looked at the street for a moment without speaking. "You wrote me a good letter," he said. "I needed you here." "You had it handled." "I had part of it handled," she said. "The federal records were the part I couldn't reach from a ranch kitchen." He was quiet for a moment. "I rode through the night," he said. "I know. I didn't want you to walk in there alone." She looked at him. "I had Danny." "Danny is many things," Ethan said. But he's not. He stopped. Not what? He looked at her directly. There was something in his face that had not been there a month ago, or it had been there but sealed behind the careful reserve he wore the way some men wore a second skin. Now it was simply present without qualification. You should have had someone in your corner, he said. Someone who was there because it mattered to him. Clara held his gaze. And was that you? You know it was, he said quietly. She looked away. Down the street where Danny had wandered off to lean against a post and study the clouds with great interest in the way of a man giving two people room. Ethan, she said. Yeah. Your condition. The 30 days. It's long past 30 days. I know. She looked at her hands. I've been thinking about what comes after. What I'm supposed to do. Whether I... She stopped. Said it honestly. Whether I'm still here because I need to be, or because I want to be. He was quiet for a moment. Which is it? He said. She looked up at him. Both, she said. I still May needs the stability. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But that's not the only reason anymore. And I think you know that, and I think it scares me a little. Why? Because the last time I built something I loved, she said, I watched it taken away. She kept her voice level. And I'm standing outside a courthouse in Montana Territory, where we just fought off a man who tried to take away something you love, and I'm very aware that nothing is guaranteed, and that caring about something means it can hurt you. Ethan turned to face her fully. Clara, he said. I'm not asking for anything, she said quickly. I'm not. I know you're not. His voice was steady. That's not the point. He paused. He looked like a man choosing his words with the same care he would use to do anything that mattered. I told you when you arrived that I didn't want people fixing what belonged to the past. I said that because the past was all I'd been living in for 5 years. He stopped. You didn't fix it. You didn't try to. You just lived in the same house with it and didn't pretend it wasn't there. And somehow that was the thing I didn't know I needed. Clara looked at him. My wife's name was Eliza, he said. It was the first time he had said her name in Clara's presence. She understood what it cost him. She died in a storm 5 years ago, trying to get our son to safety. He paused. Our son was 3. His name was Thomas. Ethan, I'm telling you because you deserve to know, he said. Not because I need you to fix it. It's not fixable. But I've been carrying it alone for 5 years and I'm... He stopped. I'm tired of alone, Clara. That's the truth of it. She looked at him for a long moment. So am I, she said. The street noise moved around them, horses and boots on boards, and the ordinary sounds of a town doing its afternoon work. Danny had disappeared entirely thoughtfully. Ethan reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it. His grip was warm and deliberate, and felt like something she hadn't realized she'd been cold without. Come home, he said. She looked up at him. You mean the ranch? I mean home, he said. She held his hand and looked at the street and thought about 38 years and 4 months of grief and 14 cents and blistered feet and a little girl who said you look like someone important, and the blue pitcher she'd moved to the front of the shelf, and Hector who stayed up until midnight sorting documents, and Danny who bet on her, and Billy who hummed when he was content. She thought about what home actually meant. All right, she said. They walked to the horses. Jumptor. The ride back to Silver Creek was quiet in the way that things are quiet when they've been decided. Danny rode ahead of them with the tact of a man who had correctly read an entire situation and chosen to pretend he hadn't, and Ethan rode beside Clara, and they talked, not about the courthouse, not about Fitch, not about what happened next in the legal proceeding, but about small things. She told him about the pattern file she'd built, and he told her about the federal land officer in Helena, who'd looked at the documentation and gone very still in a way that meant he recognized what he was seeing. She told him what Hector had said about Aldridge. He told her what his father had said about the land. They talked like people who had been not talking around the real things for weeks and had finally decided to stop. When Silver Creek came into view, May was in the yard. She saw them coming, and she stood up from whatever she'd been doing with Hector. The little girl had been learning to mend fence wire of all things, which Hector had apparently decided she was ready for, and she went absolutely still for a moment, reading her mother's face from 50 yards. Whatever she saw in it made her start running. Clara dismounted and caught her daughter and held her, and May said into her shoulder, "You won." "We won," Clara said. "Tell me everything." "I will. All of it." She held May back at arm's length and looked at her face. "But first I need to know something. Are you happy here?" May looked at her. Then she looked past her at Ethan, who had dismounted and was standing by his horse and looking at the two of them with that expression, the one that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite grief, and was something in between, something that was learning to be something else. "Yes," May said. "I think this is where we're supposed to be." Clara looked at her daughter's face. Then she looked back at the ranch, the fence lines running out toward the creek, the barn, the house with its smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, because Hector had kept the home fires going while the fight was being won elsewhere. She thought about the locked room at the top of the stairs. She thought about something she had been turning over since the night she put her hand flat against the door. That evening after supper, she went upstairs. She stood in the hall. She knocked on the door of the locked room. She heard Ethan's boots on the stairs behind her. He stopped. "I'm not trying to erase her," Clara said without turning around. "I want you to know that." A long silence. "I know," he said. "But I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, I think leaving it locked forever doesn't honor her either." She turned around. A woman who tried to save her child in a storm deserved better than a sealed room. Ethan looked at the door. The muscle in his jaw worked. He reached past Clara and put his hand on the handle. He held it there for a moment. Then he opened the door. The room was small, and it had been kept clean. He had been in here, she understood, more regularly than anyone knew, had kept it ordered, even as he kept it sealed from the rest of the world. There was a sewing basket, a small writing desk, a photograph on the wall. There was a single pressed flower in a frame beside the photograph, dried to translucence pale yellow, the same color as the wildflowers on the blue pitcher. Clara stood in the doorway and did not go in. This was not her space to enter. But she looked, and she let it be real, and beside her, Ethan stood and breathed, and let it be real too. After a moment, he said, "She would have liked you." "I think I would have liked her," Clara said. He reached up and touched the doorframe. "She always said this house had room for more than it was holding." His voice was rough. "She meant people." "She wasn't wrong," Clara said. He looked down at her. "What do we do now?" he said. And it was not only about the room. "We keep going," Clara said. "That's all there is. We keep going, and we make it matter." She looked up at him. "Together, if you'll have us." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, carefully, the way a man touches something he's decided to keep. "I'll have you," he said. "Both of you." Below them, they could hear May at the kitchen table talking to Hector about something involving the horses, her voice bright and certain, in the way of a child who has found solid ground. Danny was laughing at something Billy had said. The fire was going. The house sounded for the first time in 5 years like it was full. Ethan pulled the door of Eliza's room partially closed, not locked, not sealed, just resting. He looked at Clara. She put her hand in his. They went downstairs together, into the warmth and the noise, and the life that was still going, still building, still becoming something none of them had been able to plan for, and all of them somehow had needed. Gerald Fitch would answer for what he'd done. The federal process was moving, and it would not stop. Clara had made sure of that document by document, letter by letter, with the same stubborn precision she brought to everything. That fight was not finished. But tonight, Silver Creek Ranch was whole. And Clara Whitmore, who had arrived at this gate with 14 cents in a broken suitcase and a little girl who hadn't eaten since yesterday, understood with the particular clarity of someone who has come very far and finally stopped running, that she was not passing through anymore. She was home. The federal investigation moved faster than anyone at Silver Creek expected. 3 weeks after the courthouse hearing, a rider came from Helena with papers that Ethan read standing in the yard still holding the envelope, and then he came inside and put them on the kitchen table in front of Clara without a word. She read them. Then she read them again. Gerald Fitch had been formally charged with land fraud across 3 counties. The federal land court had issued an injunction freezing all property acquisition activity by his companies pending full investigation. 2 of his subsidiary companies, the ones that had been billing Silver Creek, had already had their operating licenses suspended. It was not finished. These things were never finished quickly. But the shape of it had changed in a way that could not be undone. Clara set the papers down. "Well," she said. "Yeah," Ethan said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. Then Danny Reeves came through the door, because Danny Reeves had an instinct for the moments he wasn't supposed to miss, and he looked at their faces and looked at the papers and said, "Is that what I think it is?" "Fitch has been charged," Ethan said. Danny sat down hard in the nearest chair. He stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "I owe Billy $2 more." "What was the bet this time?" Clara asked. "Whether it would happen before the first snow." He looked at the window. "It's October. That was close." "You bet against us," Ethan said. "I bet it would take longer," Danny said. "I did not account for Mrs. Whitmore." He looked at Clara with the particular expression he had developed over the past 2 months, something between admiration and exasperation and genuine affection. Nobody accounts for Mrs. Whitmore correctly the first time. "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me," Clara said. "Don't get used to it," he said, and went back out. The thing about winning Clara had learned by then was that it didn't feel the way you expected it to. She had thought in those early days at Silver Creek, when the situation with Fitch was becoming clear and she was building her folder of evidence document by document under the kitchen lamp, that resolution would feel like relief. A door closing, a breath finally exhaled. It felt like that, but it also felt like something opening, because the fight had given her somewhere to put all of it. The grief, the anger, the particular exhausted fury of a woman who had lost everything and been told by the world that was simply how things went. While there was a problem to solve, she had been solving it. Now the problem was mostly solved, and what was left was the question she had been too busy to ask directly. What now? She was still asking it when Agnes Tolliver came to Silver Creek for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, riding a sensible horse in a sensible coat, and bringing with her a tin of molasses cookies and a directness that Clara found immediately deeply comfortable. Agnes was 62. A widow herself, had been in the territory for 30 years, and had the particular quality of a woman who had outlasted enough difficulty to stop being surprised by it. She sat at Clara's kitchen table and ate coffee and said, "I heard you're staying on." "I am," Clara said. "Good." Agnes looked around the kitchen. This place needed a woman who knew what she was doing. No offense to Caldwell, he's a fine man, but men don't know what a house needs. "He's been learning," Clara said. Agnes looked at her with bright, specific eyes. "Has he?" "Don't," Clara said. "I'm not doing anything," Agnes said entirely unconvincingly, but she stayed for 3 hours, and when she left, she had extended an invitation to Clara to come to the monthly gathering of women in Garen's Crossing, a practical meeting. Agnes said not social, where women who ran households or managed ranches or kept books for businesses talked about what was actually happening in the county and what needed doing. Agnes had started it 7 years ago after her husband died, and she realized that the men's meetings at the saloon were where all the real decisions got made, and none of those decisions accounted for the women who were managing half the county's actual operations. "The Fitch situation woke some people up," Agnes said at the door. When Millicent Garber heard about Porter's records and what the billing companies had been doing, she went home and pulled her own accounts and found the same pattern in a grain contract. She's been furious about it for 3 weeks. Is she bringing her documentation? Clara asked. She's bringing 3 years of it. Good, Clara said. Tell her to bring the quarterly statements separated from the annual summaries. It's clearer that way. Agnes looked at her. You're going to fit in very well, she said. After she left, Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment, feeling something she hadn't felt in so long she had nearly forgotten what it was called. Belonging. Not the temporary, careful belonging of a woman who had been given 30 days to prove herself. Not the provisional contingent belonging of someone on trial. The real kind. The kind that didn't have an expiration. She went to find Ethan. He was at the north fence doing the kind of physical work that Ethan turned to when he had too much in his head, not because it needed doing right now, but because his hands needed something honest to hold. Clara had learned this about him the way she had learned all the real things about him by paying attention and waiting for what was actually there to show itself. She leaned against the fence post and watched him work for a moment. Agnes Tolliver wants me to come to the women's meeting in town, she said. I know, he said. Agnes told me she was going to ask you last week. She told you first. She asked if I could spare you one Tuesday a month. He didn't look up from what he was doing. I told her she could have you every Tuesday if she needed. Clara looked at him. That wasn't yours to offer. No, he agreed. But the answer would have been yes regardless, so I figured I'd save time. She thought about arguing with that and decided it wasn't worth it, which was itself a sign of how much things had changed. A month ago, she would have pushed back on principle. Now she understood that Ethan's particular brand of deciding things on her behalf came from a place that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with the fact that he had spent 5 years not caring about anyone's needs but his own, and was making up for lost time in the way of a man who had discovered he'd been doing something wrong and was correcting it with perhaps slightly too much enthusiasm. Porter is bringing his records to the federal hearing, she said. Agnes says 2 other families have come forward. Ethan looked up then. 2 more. Yes. The same billing companies. Same pattern. She paused. This is bigger than Silver Creek, Ethan. It always was. We were just the ones who caught it. He set down what he was holding. He looked at her steadily. You caught it, he said. We caught it, she said. Don't do that. Do what? Give it all to me. The men helped. You rode to Helena through the night. Hector sorted documents until 1 in the morning. She looked at him directly. We caught it. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. We caught it. Thank you. He picked up what he'd set down. Stay and talk to me while I work. She stayed. She talked. He worked and listened and occasionally said something, and the afternoon moved around them the way Montana afternoons moved in October, fast and cold at the edges, with a light that was low and honest about what it was. She told him about Millicent Garber and the grain contract, and he told her about a conversation he'd had with the federal land officer about what the investigation might mean for the county long term, and at some point the conversation stopped being about any of that and became about Thomas. It happened the way those conversations happened with Ethan sideways, without warning, emerging from something adjacent. He mentioned that Thomas would have been 8 this year. He said it matter-of-factly, looking at what he was doing. Clara said, What was he like? A pause. Like his mother, Ethan said. All the way through. Stubborn. Laughed at everything. He used to follow Hector around the yard the way May follows him now, asking questions about everything. Clara was very still. I know, Ethan said. He had heard what she hadn't said. I see it too. Does it hurt? She asked carefully. Yes, he said. But it's a different hurt than it was. He paused. Before seeing May was... He stopped. Now it feels like something Eliza would have thought was right. A child running around this place again. He looked up. She always said the ranch should have children in it. Clara looked at the fence line at the fields running out toward the creek at a sky that was doing the particular October thing of being both very large and very close. Ethan, she said. Yeah. I'm not trying to replace what you had. I know that. I'm just... She paused, found the words. I want to build something real, whatever that looks like. I'm not interested in performing a life. I've done that. She looked at him. I want an actual one. He set down his tools entirely. He turned and leaned against the fence post and looked at her with the full attention he gave things when he had decided they mattered. Then let's build one, he said. An actual one. She held his gaze. You make it sound simple. It is simple, he said. It's hard, but it's simple. There's a difference. She thought about that. Your father taught you that, she said. My father and 22 years of ranching, he said. Simple things are just the ones where you already know what matters. She looked at him standing there, travel-worn and honest and careful with the things that mattered to him. And she thought about the man she'd seen in the doorway that first night closed, guarded with storm cloud eyes that hadn't decided yet. And she thought about the man in front of her now, who was still guarded in places, and would probably always be because some things don't fully unlock, they just learn to be carried differently. She could live with that. She was already living with it. All right, she said. He reached out and took her hand, the way he'd taken it on the courthouse steps, with the same deliberate warmth. All right, he said. They stood at the north fence in the October light and held on, and the ranch moved around them in its ordinary way, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the specific kind of more that Clara Whitmore had stopped believing existed somewhere around the third week she'd been sleeping in a train station and counting what was left of her coins. The twist came on a Thursday morning in November, and it came from the last direction anyone expected. Fitch's lawyer came to Silver Creek. Not Casserly had removed himself from the case 2 weeks prior, which Clara had noted with professional respect, as the move of a man who recognized a sinking position. This was a different lawyer, younger, with a different quality of manner, less polished, more tired, with the look of someone carrying a message he hadn't chosen. Ethan and Clara both came out to the yard. Hector materialized at the edge of it the way Hector did. The lawyer said, I'm here on behalf of my client to convey a formal offer. He can keep his offers, Ethan said. This one is different, the lawyer said. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. My client is prepared to settle the federal claims against him by returning clear title to 2 of the properties he acquired under the circumstances currently under investigation. He is also prepared to make a direct financial settlement to Silver Creek Ranch for damages related to the billing fraud and, he paused, and the contamination of the water supply. A silence. He's admitting to the cattle, Clara said. The lawyer looked at her. My client is prepared to resolve this matter without further federal proceedings. He's scared, Ethan said. Not triumphant, just factual. My client wishes to resolve... He's scared, Ethan said again. He looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. She was thinking about Porter, about Agnes Tolliver's brother, about the 2 families who had come forward, about Millicent Garber's grain contract, any settlement that applies only to Silver Creek, she said, and that stops the federal investigation into the other properties, we won't take it. The lawyer blinked. Mrs. Whitmore, the other families were hurt the same way we were, she said. Some of them lost their land. A settlement that makes Silver Creek whole and leaves them where they are is not a settlement. It's a transaction. She kept her voice even. If your client wants to resolve this, he resolves all of it. Every property, every family. The federal investigation continues regardless, that's not ours to stop. But if he's looking for any cooperation from Silver Creek Ranch, that's the condition. The lawyer looked at Ethan. Ethan said, You heard her. After the lawyer left, Danny Reeves came out from the barn, where he had been listening with absolutely zero pretense of subtlety. He looked at Clara. You just turned down a settlement, he said. Yes. That was money. It was, she agreed. For people who aren't us. For people who deserve the same chance we got, she said. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want you to know that I think that was the right thing, and it also scared the life out of me." "Good," Clara said. "That means it mattered." He laughed, his real laugh, the surprised one. "Yeah," he said. "I reckon it does." Fitch ultimately settled on terms that included Silver Creek, but they also included restitution to Porter's family compensation for Agnes Tolliver's brother at a rate that didn't undo 5 years of lost land, but acknowledged what had been taken, and a formal federal agreement that applied across all 7 affected properties in 3 counties. It took another 4 months. It was not simple, and it was not clean, and there were 3 separate hearings that Clara attended, twice with Ethan, and once alone when he couldn't leave the ranch during calving season. She went alone, and she came back with what they needed, and Ethan met her in the yard when she rode in and said, "Well, we have the restitution agreement for Porter," she said, "and the Hendersons. All of it. All of it." He lifted her down from the horse. She let him. His hands were steady and certain, and she had stopped being startled by the way it felt to be certain of someone. She was learning to simply be in it, the way you learn to be in warmth after being cold for a very long time, carefully at first, then naturally, then as though you had never known anything else. "Come inside," he said. "Hector made something he's calling a celebration supper, but it's mostly the same food he always makes." "Hector's food is excellent," she said. "Don't tell him that," Ethan said. His head's already enormous on the subject. She laughed, a real one, all the way through, and they went inside. May turned 8 in December. Ethan asked her at breakfast what she wanted for her birthday, and May said without any hesitation at all that she wanted to learn to ride properly, not the way Hector had been letting her sit on the gentle mare in the yard. Actually ride. Ethan looked at her across the table, with that expression, the one Clara had first seen the night they arrived, when he'd looked at a hungry 7-year-old, and something had shifted in his face, and he said, "How early can you be up Saturday morning?" May said, "Earlier than you." He said, "We'll see about that." Saturday morning, May was dressed and in the yard before anyone else was awake. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Ethan came out and found her standing by the fence in the cold gray pre-dawn, with her breath making small clouds, and she watched him stop and look at the child, and she watched something move through him that was both loss and its opposite, both grief and the thing that grows in the same soil if you let it. He tipped his hat at May. May tipped an imaginary hat back very seriously. He saddled 2 horses. Clara made coffee and held it in both hands and watched them ride out toward the east field in the early morning light, the tall man and the small girl, and she felt something in her chest that was full enough to hurt in the best possible way. She thought about the woman who had collapsed against a stranger's door, with mud on her dress and 14 cents in her pocket, and a daughter too exhausted to cry. She thought about how that woman had believed in the very worst of the nights between St. Louis and Silver Creek, that there was nothing left, that the life she was riding toward was simply the absence of the life she'd lost. That survival was the best she could reasonably hope for. She thought about how wrong that woman had been. The formal hearing that finally closed the Fitch case was held in Helena in February, and Clara attended with Ethan and Agnes Tolliver and Porter, who had driven 4 hours in a wagon that had seen better decades and arrived with his records in a wooden box and his wife on his arm, and his jaw set in a way that told Clara everything she needed to know about what this day meant to him. The federal judge read the settlement terms into the record. He confirmed the fraud charges. He confirmed the restitution agreements. He looked at the assembled parties across the room and said with the flat precision of federal language that the matter was resolved to the satisfaction of the court. Agnes Tolliver said under her breath, "About time." Porter looked at Clara. His eyes were wet. He was not a man who cried easily. She could tell that the same way she could tell most things about people by paying attention, and the fact that he was not quite managing to prevent it now told her more than any words would have. "Thank you," he said. "You did your part," Clara said. "You kept your records." "My wife kept my records," he said. "I kept telling her to throw them out." He paused. I am going to owe that woman an apology for about 40 years. Clara smiled. Send her my regards. Outside the federal building on the steps in the February cold, Ethan stood beside her and looked at the street and said nothing for a moment, and she let him be quiet because she had learned that his quiet after important things was not distance. It was digestion. He was taking in what had happened and making it real for himself in the particular internal way he did everything. After a moment he said, "My father would have wanted to be here today." "I think he was," Clara said. Ethan looked at her. "In the way people are," she said, "when what they built holds against something that tried to bring it down." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." Clara looked at him. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "Not because the 30 days ran out and you have nowhere else to be. Not because you've earned your place or proven yourself you did all of that months ago." He paused. He looked at her with those storm cloud eyes that had learned over the course of one Montana winter to be something other than closed. "Because I want you there. Because May belongs there. Because that house is more itself with both of you in it than it ever was without you. And because—" He stopped. He started again. "Because I have loved you for a while now, and I have not been particularly subtle about it, and I believe it would be better for everyone if I said so plainly." Clara looked at him standing there in the February cold, on the steps of a federal building in Helena, Montana, having just told the truth in the most Ethan Caldwell way possible, direct, undecorated, without strategy. "That is the least romantic proposal I have ever heard," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been practicing it, and it kept coming out the same." "It also," she said, "sounds exactly like you." "Yes, and I have loved you for a while too," she said, in case that was unclear. "It wasn't entirely unclear," he said. "Good." She took his arm. "Let's go home." They were married in April when the fields were coming back, and the creek was running clear, and Silver Creek Ranch was in the middle of its best calving season in 6 years. Hector stood up for Ethan. May stood up for Clara, in a dress that Agnes Tolliver had helped alter, and she stood with the seriousness and joy of a child who understood completely what this day was and what it meant, and was choosing all the way through to be glad. Danny Reeves cried during the ceremony, and told everyone loudly that he had something in his eye. Nobody believed him. Nobody said so. Agnes Tolliver brought enough food for twice the number of people present, which was exactly right, because by mid-afternoon, half the county seemed to have found a reason to be at Silver Creek. Porter came. The Hendersons came. People Clara had met only through letters arrived in wagons with their families, and their Sunday clothes, and their particular frontier version of joy, unpolished and real and loud, filling the yard with a sound that the ranch had not held in 5 years. Hector stood at the edge of it all, watching with his coffee going cold in his hand, and a look on his face that Clara had never seen before, and recognized immediately as happiness. She went and stood beside him. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "9 years I've been on this ranch," he said. "Watched that man close every door that wanted to open, told myself it wasn't my business." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad someone finally had the stubbornness to knock on them anyway." "He opened them himself," Clara said. "He needed a reason to," Hector said. He looked at her. "You were the reason." She looked at the yard full of people. She looked at May running between the adults, with Billy Marsh chasing after her laughing. She looked at Ethan standing across the yard who was talking to Porter, but watching her over the older man's shoulder with an expression that was whole, in a way she had not seen in him when she arrived, as though some interior fracture had been set and healed and was now simply part of the structure rather than the wound. He caught her looking. He smiled. Not the ghost of one. Not the brief, rusty approximation she'd first seen in the kitchen weeks before everything changed. A real one all the way through, the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there. She smiled back. "Chug," Years later, when people in Garen's Crossing told the story of Silver Creek Ranch, and they did tell it, the way people tell stories that have the particular shape of something true. They talked about the widow who had arrived with nothing and fought a powerful man to a standstill with a ledger and a folder of documents and a refusal to be made small. They talked about the rancher who had closed himself off for 5 years and been opened again, not by anyone trying to fix him, but by a woman who looked at his grief and did not flinch from it. They talked about the little girl who had grown up running between fence lines, asking questions about everything, who learned to ride before she was 8 and to keep accounts before she was 12, who carried both her father's stubbornness and her mother's precision, and used them equally well. They told the story the way good stories should be told, not as a lesson, not as an instruction, but as evidence. Evidence that people survive what seems unsurvivable. That grief properly carried does not prevent living. That the right door opened at the right time can change the entire shape of what a life becomes. Clara Whitmore had arrived at Ethan Caldwell's gate with nothing but her daughter and her nerve, and the stubborn insistence that she deserved something better than disappearing. She had not arrived looking for love. She had not arrived looking for rescue. She had arrived looking for a chance, and she had taken that chance and done something with it that no one, including herself, had quite been able to predict. She had walked into a house full of locked rooms and closed off grief, and a man who trusted horses more than people, and she had not tried to fix any of it. She had simply stayed. She had worked. She had paid attention. She had fought when fighting was what was needed, and been still when stillness was. She had let herself be known, which was the hardest thing of all, and she had let herself know someone else, which was harder still. And in doing that, in refusing to be less than herself, even when the world was suggesting very strongly that she should be, she had built something that lasted. The land was still there. The cattle ran the fields. The creek ran clear. The house was full. The rooms were open. And Clara Whitmore Caldwell, who had once pressed 14 cents in her palm and calculated what survival cost, understood finally and completely that survival had never been the point. The point was this, all of it. The noise in the yard, and the hand on her arm, and the child's voice calling from somewhere out past the barn, and the coffee going cold on the kitchen shelf beside a small blue pitcher painted with wildflowers in yellow and white. The point was the life she had been brave enough to stay for. And she had stayed. And it was more than enough. It was everything.